One of the principal enemies of this project is democracy. Therefore, it is incumbent upon me to supply a definition of democracy. Democracy is an example of an essentially contested subject par excellence. Perhaps the best known definition is that of Abraham Lincoln in his 1863 Gettysburg Address: government of the people, by the people, for the people. Scholarly definitions of democracy are divided essentially into the classical or substantive definitions and the procedural definitions. The former perspective sees democracy as fulfilling certain ideals, such as Rousseau's general will, the recognition of the political equality of individuals, or as a system that produces certain political rights and liberties. The procedural tradition, represented by the likes of Schumpeter, Popper, and Dahl, understands democracy in terms of specific decision-making mechanisms. Examples of proceduralist definitions include, quote, the right of the people to judge and to dismiss their government, Popper, 1947, or, quote, a method of collective decision-making characterized by a kind of equality among the participants at an essential stage of the decision-making process, end quote, Cristiano. As should be clear, proceduralist and substantive understandings of democracy allow for considerable overlap. I argue that most current scholarly approaches take for granted an essentially liberal notion of what constitutes the people, despite Schumpeter's recognition that this is a concept which has changed over time. What one understands democracy to be is logically predicated on what one understands the demos to be. This video will propose a taxonomy of democracy that takes this foundational concept as its starting point. It is a common view amongst scholars that modern states must base their claims to legitimacy on the basis of their democratic credentials. Yet any such claims are dismissed out of hand when they are made by states whose practice of democracy is not recognizable to a liberal democrat. This essay will propose an alternative approach. I will argue that one may take, quite seriously, the claims of Stalinist and fascist states to be democratic, given that their respective ideological starting points leads them to divergent conceptions of how the people are envisaged. Different understandings of democracy will emerge. Such alternative conceptions may not be recognizable to liberals, but this is to be expected and does not in itself constitute a reason for dismissing their claims to constitute bona fide forms of democracy. This thesis is driven neither by a wish to defend such regimes nor by any implicit moral relativism, but rather by the need for intellectual clarity and rigor. The people is a social construct, and as such, has been a notion subject to constant flux throughout history. The Athenian construction of the people is unrecognizable to modern-day liberals. If the meaning of the people can change from what it was prior to the advent of liberal democracy, it must be open to change after liberal democracy. To argue otherwise is counterintuitive, anti-historical, and intellectually dishonest. Accordingly, it will be argued that democracy is synonymous with political modernity. As such, all the political ideologies of modernity, not only liberalism, but also communism and fascism, are legitimately democratic, on the basis that these three ideologies have different conceptions of the people, and consequently differing understandings and practices of democracy. The structure of this essay will be as follows. The first section will discuss the hermeneutical challenges we face in understanding democracy. For example, what is the demos? On that basis, the second section will then attempt a working definition of democracy. It is to be expected that most readers will find this definition disorientating. Therefore, the third section will place the phenomenon of democracy in the historical context which informs my understanding. The fourth section will return to the question of the people and introduce Alexander Dugin's idea of the historical subject as a lens through which to understand the plurality of approaches that are available to tackle this concept. The fifth, sixth, and seventh sections will detail the taxonomy of democracies proposed by this essay, the division of democracy into liberal, communist, and fascist democracies. Kongzi said that the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their right names. One way to read this sage counsel is to say that if we are to communicate meaningfully, words must carry the same meaning for all parties involved. This becomes a challenge in the case of normatively loaded words like democracy. A temptation always exists to define words that carry a certain moral weight prior to their definition, like democracy or racism, in such a way that it brings said moral weight to bear upon one's opponents. To do so, as scholars often regrettably do, is to wield words as weapons rather than tools, and so to slip from scholarship into rhetoric. Therefore, in defining democracy, there exists an imperative to define it in such a way that the same thing is denoted regardless which theoretical perspective is being assumed. This would entail a minimalist definition that allows for a broad range of interpretations without it becoming devoid of intelligible sense. At first glance, defining democracy might appear a simple exercise in etymology. Democracy is a Greek word that derives from demos, the people, and kratia, rule or power. Indeed, the oldest surviving recorded defense of democracy defines it in precisely these terms. Quote, "Our constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority but of the whole people." Pericles in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. This then prompts two questions. Who and what are the people, if such an entity even exists, and what does it mean for them to rule or hold power? These questions will be dealt with in turn. It is curious that the question of what the people are as an entity is taken as a given in the literature on democratic theory. It is most remarkable that the central concept of democracy is not something that champions of democracy have felt the need to define. It would surely draw comment if a champion of aristocracy or meritocracy should fail to provide a definition of the best or the meritorious. Before proceeding any further, it must be clarified that in this essay, contrary to common practice in discussions of democracy, be they conducted by advocates or critics, the terms the masses or the mass are not used as synonyms for the people. The masses here refer specifically to that great majority of a population that is not significantly involved in political activity. The people, for one thing, includes in itself the politically active, i.e. elites and activist non-elites, but is also conceived of in democracy as a unitary actor capable of having a will. One thinks, for example, of the various constitutions and statements of politicians which declare themselves to speak for the will of the people. The issue of the will of the people is of crucial importance. If democracy denotes the exercise of power by the people must have a will, or else the exercise of power by the people is a meaningless statement. What would it mean for an entity without a will to rule? Is a monarchy if the king is brain dead? The people, understood in the sense indicated above, should be distinguished from people with a lowercase p, considered simply as a plurality of individuals. The latter cannot have a singular will without forming themselves into a unified actor. If the case were otherwise, it would not be possible for a unified will to exist. To speak of a mere plurality of individuals having a singular will is a nonsense. They can only have a plurality of individual wills unless there exists a unanimous consensus. In real existing democracies, unanimity is almost never to be found, if indeed it is ever even attempted. Thus, a typical statement can be seen at the very beginning of the Indian Constitution. We, the people of India, the will being expressed by the text of this document, if it is to be taken seriously, must express something other than that of all of the individuals of Indian citizenship. Indian citizens have never been unanimous in their will, and even if they were, this situation would change the moment a new Indian citizen comes into being, whether by naturalization or birth. The will of the people must therefore refer to something other than simply the totality of separate wills found in a group of individuals. This is recognized in the widespread awareness that sees sovereignty residing in the people. Yet sovereignty cannot be divided, so sovereignty must be embodied in a unified actor. Clearly, then, the people constitutes a social fact quite apart from the material fact of the plurality of individuals on the basis of which it is constructed. The people being a social construct, it admits, as do all social constructs, of a plurality of forms. To insist that our understanding of the people must possess a singular or exclusive meaning is to engage in baseless univocality. The matter of the various ways in which the people has been constructed will be returned to in section 4. Having addressed the matter of the demos, the question of kratia, rule or power, will now be turned to. How does the people, however it is constructed, exercise power? Liberal Democrats operate under the often unspoken assumption that this means exercise of free, fair, and regular voting, either on policies or for representatives. This understanding is acceptable, as far as it goes, as long as one is already committed to the ideological framework of liberalism. It is not satisfactory, however, if one wishes to define democracy in such a way as to include all self-described theories of democracy. It is of course entirely acceptable that liberals regard only liberal forms of democracy to be legitimate forms of democracy. Indeed, it would be peculiar if a liberal did not hold to this. It is, however, intellectually dishonest not to acknowledge the existence of other theories of democracy, whatever one's normative view of those theories may be. For example, there are conceptions of democracy that envisage the demos as exercising its power through mechanisms other than that of free, fair, and regular elections. Therefore, any definition of democracy must, in order to be mutually agreeable to all self-identified Democrats, refrain from specifying how the people should assert their sovereignty. We come then to a provisional definition as follows. Democracy is a political system whereby authority is wielded by the people. This definition, while being satisfactory to all forms of Democrats, is not so broad as to lose all meaning. The definition is clearly distinct from, for instance, a monarchy, aristocracy, or oligarchy. In this way, it recalls Aristotle's classical definition of democracy as, quote, rule by the many, end quote. While being more specific, an oligarchy may also constitute rule by many, while, as has been argued, the rule of the people comprises something more than just many individuals. This definition is, however, unsatisfying. As will be explored in further depth later on, a good portion of critics of democracy, amongst whom the present author counts himself, deny that the people ruling is a possibility. The reason given for this are variegated. René Guénon, for example, argues that the very idea is incoherent. Quote, if the word democracy is defined as the government of the people by themselves, it expresses an absolute impossibility and cannot even have a mere de facto existence. In our time, more than in any other, the relationship of ruler and ruled necessitates the joint presence of two terms. There could be no ruled if there were not also rulers. End quote. Exponents of elite theory have put forward other objections. Gaetano Mosca argued that an organized minority will always be able to outmaneuver a disorganized majority, such that the former is always likely to prevail. Joseph Schumpeter suggested that, since most people passively imbibe their opinions from elites, any notion that the people possesses an independent will is spurious. In fact, one could go further and argue that the very concept of the people is a fiction, thus subverting the assumption that such an entity is capable of ruling itself. If the above definition is rejected, how can the supporters and skeptics of democracy engage in any kind of dialogue? Democracy may be treated as a hypothetical entity, a kind of utopia, but how can we then meaningfully discuss real-world democracies, RWDs? The difficulty is clear in the work of Mosca. At least in his early writings, Mosca makes the claim that there are no monarchies or democracies, only aristocracies. How then are we to differentiate self-identifying aristocratic polities from constitutional democracies without sinking into a quagmire of two-track jargon? Therefore, the following definition of democracy is proposed. Democracy is a political arrangement whereby any claim to legitimacy is valid to the degree that there is conformity with the will of the people. This definition is acceptable to both positions. From the perspective of Democrats, this formulation is arguably consistent with the provisional definition provided earlier. Should one favor power being exercised by the people, it follows that decisions and decision-making processes are legitimate to the extent that they reflect said people's will. So, if one then holds that the claims of legitimacy is contingent on the degree of conformity to the will of the people, it follows that one would want the people to exercise power directly or indirectly. From the perspective of being maximally inclusive of all democratic positions, this new definition subsumes the provisional definition, while having the further advantage of admitting degrees of democracy. This definition says nothing of the reality of a posited will of the people, and so should also be acceptable to the skeptics, as it defines democracy in terms of its claims. Both Democrats and skeptics believe that which is denoted democracy makes this claim, regardless of if they believe it is a legitimate claim. By defining democracy in terms of claims alone, we now have a formulation that is acceptable to both camps. This creates an opening for those who deny the very possibility of democracy to discuss real-world democracies in a constructive manner. Furthermore, the wording of this definition allows for democracy to be clearly distinguished in contradistinction to other possible arrangements. What is meant by this will become clear in the course of the next section, in which this definition of democracy is placed in historical context. Democracy is synonymous with the political culture of Western modernity. As such, in the westernized world we inhabit today, the concept is possessed of such ubiquity that, in trying to identify democracy as a discrete phenomenon, we verge on being in the position of the proverbial turtle trying to explain the concept of water to the fish. In order to properly appreciate what water is, the fish must see it from the outside. Therefore, in this section, I will provide a brief sketch of political legitimacy in traditional societies so that the nature of political modernity may be better appreciated by virtue of the contrast. Democracy is the political manifestation or expression of the involutive phenomenon that Guénon denotes modernity. According to Guénon, modernity is not reducible to science or technology as such, nor simply to the present, but rather to an entirely negative phenomenon that is rooted in the rejection of a metaphysical dimension to reality. In contrast to modernity stands tradition, a hierarchical worldview maintained for most of human history that was oriented towards the transcendent, considered as ultimate reality. This orientation was reflected in traditional social orders, where the mass of humanity conformed itself to ever-ascending strata of humanity as determined by their greater proximity to a sacred order that transcends humanity and the relative world of phenomena. This social hierarchy culminated in an elite who were distinguished by their unique relationship to the absolute. Accordingly, this exclusive spiritual aristocracy was held to be qualitatively different from the rest of humanity by virtue of their superior faculties. Finally, the absolute, often presented in an anthropomorphic guise, such as a cosmic monarch, sat at the very apex of ontological reality, which, in turn, was also viewed as the summit of political authority. As such, all traditional political orders can be termed, if the word is properly understood, a sad rarity, as theocracies. In traditional societies, legitimacy flowed from above. One was legitimate insofar as one conformed to the absolute. To reiterate the previous paragraphs in more accessible terms, human society can be envisaged as a pyramid. This is particularly appropriate given the recurring use of pyramids as symbols of sacred order in complex traditional societies. In traditional civilizations, the source of legitimacy was located not within, but above human society. This is, in part, what is communicated by the frequent symbolic equation of the absolute with the sky, that which is above all. For our purposes, we may picture the absolute as a rain cloud above the pyramid. Legitimacy descends, like rain, such that it first reaches the tip of the pyramid, society, before flowing down to the bottom. The legitimacy of a sacerdotal monarch, the tip of the pyramid, was derived from his or her nearness to the absolute, represented by the cloud. In some societies, this meant that the peak of the pyramid was the first to receive the rain, as in the Islamic civilization or in Eastern and Western Christendom. In other cases, the regal personage actually participated ontologically in the absolute, which can then be represented by the peak entering the cloud. A complementary image to that of the legitimacy rain flowing down the pyramid is that of the pyramids being shaped like a directional arrow. The legitimacy of the higher strata derives from their directing the entire structure towards the cloud above. In either case, the ultimate source of legitimacy is suprahuman. Modernity is an inversion of this sacred disposition. The West gradually severed the head of its own legitimate political hierarchy hierarchy, which led to a gradual degradation of humanity and to the ultimate source of legitimacy, the absolute, being completely subverted. As a consequence, political legitimacy in modernity is sustained merely by the mass of humanity and is thus drawn upward as out of a well. This, then, gives us an alternative characterization of democracy, an inversion of the normal order of political legitimacy as found in all traditional societies. This process of a descending locus of legitimacy is suggested by Plato's cycle of regime decline in the Republic, as well as in Hindu scriptures, which portend the advent of the Kali Yuga. As a mirror image of the traditional political order, democracy is a political order in which legitimacy is drawn from the will of the people. De Tocqueville's likening of the role of the people in a democracy to that of God was no mere poetical flourish, but rather a statement of deep metaphysical significance, regardless of whether or not de Tocqueville intended it as such. This inversion of normality is something that will be expanded upon in subsequent sections, but for now it is enough to note that in traditional society, legitimacy was gained by divining the will of heaven, as in modernity, legitimacy of a political order is gained by divining, by different methods according to one's creed, the will of the people. The people is the mass that exists at the base of the pyramid, cut off from its leading element, and which also comprises its entire reality. Here we find a parallel with the simultaneous transcendence and immanence of the absolute, a further inversion of tradition. While belief in the absolute, or the people, is certainly necessary in both instances to recognize such claims to legitimacy as sound, no such belief is necessary in either case to recognize how legitimacy is claimed. Thus, we return to the definition of democracy stated earlier, a political order in which legitimacy is proportional to the degree of conformity with the will of the people, in contrast to the theocratic models in which legitimacy is conferred by divine reality itself. I have suggested that democracy is the quintessence of politics in modernity. It may reasonably be objected, however, that our claim is incongruous with the origins of this form of government in 6th century Greece. While it is true that the genesis of democracy far precedes the onset of modernity, they are of a piece insofar as they have both become unmoored from the sacred. That intimations of modernity should exist in traditional culture is unsurprising. As Houston Smith has observed, even the most pious civilization has had its atheists. This phenomenon can be accounted for with reference to the metaphysical principles of yin-yang, or that of the interpenetration of all dharmas, as set forth by the Huayan school of Mahayana Buddhism. That is to say, reality, being a unity at its most fundamental level, contains all its phenomena and their opposites in an interconnected web of mutual dependency. So, to find early intimations of modernity in traditional civilizations is to be expected in a certain measure. It is significant that these deviations from the traditional paradigm were, if you will, akin to Jungian shadows of the prevailing norms. Such periods as the Periclean age of Athens, where modernist intimations made an appearance prior to modernity itself, may be viewed mutatis mutandis as instances of what Bai Tongdong identifies as early modernity. As was the case with the Qin dynasty, Athenian democracy succumbed to a regime grounded in the sacred and was reviled for most of subsequent history until the arrival of modernity. An alternative response to the question of Athens could be that of de Tocqueville, which is to deny that Athens was a democracy at all. In fact, he believed it was, quote, only an aristocratic republic in which all the nobles had an equal right to government, end quote. Although de Tocqueville's argument may well get a sympathetic hearing from those who define democracy as entailing political equality, such equality has no place in the definition of democracy proposed in this essay. Indeed, to accept de Tocqueville's thesis would leave us in the awkward position of having to argue that the regime that gave birth to the word democracy was, in fact, no democracy at all. Rather, it would seem that the ancient Athenians had a rather different notion of what constitutes the demos than did the French aristocrat. It is to this question, the meaning of the people, that we will turn to in the next section. Bertrand de Jouvenel argues that, prior to modernity, only the concept of people with a lowercase p existed, not the people with an uppercase p. The people with an uppercase p emerges as a concept from the mind of the father of modern political theory, Thomas Hobbes. It is he who gave birth to the notion that the people could bring together their individual wills so as to form a unified actor, as depicted so strikingly on the frontispiece of Leviathan. It takes little reflection, then, to see why, early modernities notwithstanding, traditional rulers and political thinkers simply did not factor the will of the people into their considerations, while being perfectly capable of being much concerned with the welfare of their people. If no such thing as the people exists at the ontological level of social construction, then there is no question of them having a will to be considered. The most fundamental question when it comes to taxonomizing democracy is the question of how the people is defined. The question is, for two reasons, anterior to and more fundamental than how the people exercise power. Firstly, because the doer of an action is, perforce, ontologically prior to the action being undertaken. The people must be before they can exercise any power. Secondly, because how power is exercised is contingent on the nature of the people. Moreover, the further claim is here made that there is no such thing as a pure democracy. As we have already seen, the very existence of the people is open to dispute. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that any ontology of the people is open to an array of interpretations. What one understands democracy to be rests on what one discerns the people to be. At the beginning of this essay, a claim was made which the viewer most likely found to be highly counterintuitive, that not only liberalism, but both communism and fascism are democratic. In what follows, this claim will be justified. In the fourth political theory, Alexander Dugin argues that modernity has produced three political ideologies: liberalism, communism, and fascism. What distinguishes each of them is that which they take to be their historical subject. This term refers to the principal axiological, historiosophical, analytical, and sociological elements of a given ideology. In Dugin's assessment, the historical subject of liberalism is the individual, that of communism is class, and of fascism the nation or race. I consider Dugin's analysis sound, although the qualification nation or race seems redundant in this context. While I appreciate Dugin's wording things in this way so as to acknowledge that not all forms of fascism are racist, most notably classical Italian fascism, it is clear if one consults the texts of racist fascists that they treat race and nation as synonymous. For racist fascists, the historical subject is also the nation. It is just they understand the concept of nation in racial rather than cultural or civic terms. In this assessment, I follow Cornelio Codreanu, who affirmed that Italian fascism and German National Socialism, along with his own movement, were all essentially nationalist in nature, even though each had a different understanding of nation. Therefore, going forward, I will refer to the historical subject of fascism as simply the nation. These three ideologies then understand the people in terms of their respective historical subjects. Liberalism understands the people in terms of the individual, communism in terms of the class, and fascism in terms of the nation. The most fundamental division in a comprehensive taxonomy of democracy is, I would argue, in terms of the historical subject the people is identified with. In the next three sections, I will treat each ideological perspective in turn, gradually building a taxonomy that will be depicted in a series of tables. I anticipate my viewer is likely a liberal, at least in that they likely understand the people in terms of the liberal historical subject, knowingly or otherwise, and I will therefore not have to justify the democratic credentials of liberal democracy. I anticipate that the reader is also likely to give qualified recognition to the communist forms of democracy, with the proviso that they only extend such recognition to recognizably liberal forms of communist democracy, that is to say, forms of democracy that could be seen to take their historical subject as the individual. I, however, make the bolder claim that so-called Stalinist states are also democratic. I will therefore expend more effort justifying my descriptive, as opposed to normative, defense, quote-unquote, of Stalinist democracy than I will on forms acceptable to liberals. Finally, my claims regarding fascist democracy are likely to be more contentious than my other claims regarding communist democracy. While a liberal is likely to give qualified acceptance to my claims regarding the democratic credentials of communism, I would anticipate my claims regarding fascism are likely to be rejected outright. I will therefore spend most effort justifying this last claim. Not all theories are equal. Some theories Providence promotes to a position of preeminence by giving them practical instantiation. It may be ill-advised to write this in a text intended for a scholarly audience, but the constitutions implemented by those with state power matter more than the constitutions drawn up by scholars. This should be borne in mind by scholars lest we wish to be entombed in our ivory towers. As a corollary of this, the theorizing behind political arrangements that have actually been instantiated will be given greater weight in the following analysis than those which have yet to be given practical expression. It may be objected by those with no belief in providence that this approach is problematic. One could object that, for example, Leninism's triumph over council communism or Hitlerism's triumph over Strasserism did not have to happen, and that my approach is therefore somehow biased. In my view, it is rather incomprehensible to say that anything that did in fact happen did not have to happen. Had it not happened, we would be living in some other universe from the one we do, in fact, inhabit. One may refer to Fa Zhang's argument in his The Rafter Dialogue in support of this point. It is indicative of liberalism's metapolitical dominance, at least in the Anglophone world, that democracy is used as if it were a shorthand for liberal democracy. Indeed, the chief axiological concern of liberalism, personal liberty, is often misidentified as the defining feature of democratic polities. Indeed, the body of academic literature devoted to democratic theory concerns itself exclusively with its liberal variant. This is not to say that this is a conscious decision on the part of democratic theorists, but rather that it is a demonstration of the metapolitical dominance of liberalism in the academy. To reiterate, what is denoted here by liberal democracy is something distinct from, but inclusive of, what this term is taken to mean in democratic theory, where it is generally synonymous with representative democracy, what Carl Schmitt called parliamentarism. What is meant by liberal democracy in this essay is democracy as understood by liberals. This is to say, any and all forms of democracy where the demos, or the people, are understood in terms of the historical subject of liberalism, the individual. While in practice, liberal democracies in this sense usually are representative democracies, they need not be. Indeed, many of the world's liberal democratic states incorporate direct democracy to some degree. This entails only a slight adjustment in how the people exercises its power, and no adjustment at all in what the people is understood to be. Before addressing the question of how liberal democracy constructs the people, it is necessary to acknowledge a tension between liberalism and democracy. Liberalism being axiologically individualist, there is a necessary tension between liberalism and something so inherently collectivist as democracy. That an internal contradiction exists within liberal democracy is not an original observation. Indeed, the conflict between liberal and democratic principles was of concern to such luminaries as Madison, de Tocqueville, and Mill. Furthermore, the only unqualified rejection of democracy from within modernity comes from liberals, especially from the rather intransigent variety called libertarians, such as Erich Ritter von Kühnelt-Ledin, Hans Hermann Hoppe, Brian Kaplan, and Jason Brennan. Among liberals who do endorse democracy, this tension manifests in the instrumentalist argument, which endorses democracy on the basis that it optimally ensures some liberal good or goods. Perhaps the most influential representative of this position is James Madison. Such ideas are not democratic as such, in that they do not see legitimacy as flowing from conformity to the will of the people, but rather take the insurance of liberal priorities as the state's basis for its claim to legitimacy. This liberal endorsement of democracy thus needs to be qualified, which then makes liberalism, as a whole, arguably less democratic than orthodox Marxist-Leninism or fascism. Unlike the latter two ideologies, liberals may recognize a higher source of good than the will of the people, rather than identifying said good with the will of the people. This allows for a priori restrictions on what the people may will in the form of laws protecting minorities. Influential though such ideas may be in the academy and in influencing institutional design, Providence has not seen fit to make Madisonian instrumentalism metapolitically dominant. This can be demonstrated by the observably greater prominence of appeals in liberal democratic discourse to something being legitimate legitimate on the basis of its being in line with the will of the people rather than its being liberal. The supremacy of one concept over another in this discourse is evident when you consider which of the two becomes subordinated when they come into conflict. It is unheard of to oppose something considered democratic simply because it is illiberal. For example, in order for liberals to safeguard minority rights by insulating them from the will of the people, they must appropriate the hegemonic legitimacy of democracy by arguing that human rights are integrally democratic, or that the chief aim of democracy is freedom. That they may well do so unconsciously only further demonstrates the metapolitical subordination of Madisonian instrumentalism. What then is, in the liberal construction, the people? To repeat, liberalism's political subject is the individual. Therefore, it constructs a notion of the people on the basis of the rational, self-interested, and utility-maximizing individual. This means that the liberal construction of the people is necessarily a more complex enterprise than its analogue amongst communists and fascists. Liberalism sees the people as an aggregation of the individual wills into a single entity. This process is given effect through the process of voting. It is via voting that, in a liberal democracy, the people is brought both into being and, at the same time, is able to exercise its power. This is because it comprises a multitude of individuals who, voluntarily, submit to making their wills one through the ballot box. According to Lockean theory and liberal democratic practice, the outcomes of this process are binding on dissenting minorities. The reason for this, in a manner clearly influenced by Hobbes, is that by constituting part of the people, their consent to the majority decision is implied. Their individual wills are included in that of the people as a whole, even if the latter is contrary to their expressed preferences, because these individuals freely participated in the very process that created the people. This is, by Locke's reckoning, embedded within a social contract myth, albeit one that he regarded as historical fact. There are two significant implications to this Lockean account. Jurisprudentially, it reconciles liberal individualism with the democracy as a claim to legitimacy on the basis of the will of a collective actor. Ethically, it serves as the basis of liberal democratic claims to non-instrumental good in democracy. For example, it provides the theoretical grounds upon which the claim that liberal democracy constitutes governance, quote, by the consent of the governed, end quote, is based. Without this framework, one cannot see in what sense someone on the losing side of a vote is being governed by their own consent. Furthermore, it is the theoretical foundation for liberalism's, at least partial, equation of democracy with the procedure of voting in a free, fair, and regular manner. Free and fair being understood in terms of giving voice to liberalism's historical subject. This then becomes a premise for the argument that participating in this process is salutary for the development of citizens, in that it expresses individual dignity through an exercise in which their equality is properly recognized. Some nuances should be touched on regarding the above account. Even a passing familiarity with the history of liberal democracies reveals a plurality of conceptions of what constitutes the liberal individual. The liberal individual is clearly not simply a human being. Liberalism conceives of the individual as a rational agent, and this in turn serves as the basis for liberal individualism. As such, at least implicitly, this serves as the basis for exclusion of certain persons from democratic politics on the basis of their supposed deficient capacity for rational thought. This has historically excluded such large and varied categories of persons from membership in the people, the unpropertied, women, non-whites, slaves, etc., that an absolute majority of states' populations were excluded from voting, a situation mirroring that of ancient Athens, the mother of democracies. These facts are quite well known, but deserve rehearsing so as to give liberal democrats reason for reflection. One may be tempted to dismiss the above notions as undemocratic and only accept universal adult suffrage as a democratic minimum. Indeed, this is implied in the frequent references to South Africa's 1994 election as its first democratic election, and such historical revisionism as has been attempted by some scholars like Chung Ha-joon. The problem with such notions is that their consistent application renders democracy a system system of exceptionally recent vintage. The United Kingdom, from this perspective, was not a democracy until 1948, and the United States was not a democracy until 1964, and Switzerland was not a democracy until 1971. This would leave us in a rather absurd position, as it renders all discussion of democracy prior to the second half of the 20th century quite unintelligible. Furthermore, it would be observed that all real existing liberal democracies continue to exclude vast swathes of their populations from voting. Children are excluded precisely on the basis of their not being rational individuals, even if this is admitted to be a temporary state for those not mentally handicapped. Nationalism continues to play a real role in excluding foreigners, i.e. non-members of nation, from the vote, and thus the people. In some states, criminals are excluded from enfranchisement, something that could be justified on the basis of Lockean social contract theory. In light of all this, the liberal democrat should concede that even liberal democracy admits of a plurality of conceptions of the people, which is to say nothing of democracy as such. A second nuance in the liberal conception of the people is the schizophrenic nature of the people. As we shall see, the competing communist and fascist constructions of the people equate it quite straightforwardly with a single collective entity, though this is somewhat more complicated in the case of communism, while in liberalism, a collective entity capable of a unitary will is aggregated out of a plurality of individual wills. As already acknowledged, this is only feasible by way of a kind of majoritarianism. This majoritarianism is prevented by liberal principles from simply dismissing dissenting voices altogether. While dissenters are bound to obey, they are free to dissent. This nuance in liberal democratic theory means that within the head of the unitary actor, the people, there exists a plurality of voices, even if the people supposedly speaks with a single voice, as is indeed the case in the heads of most real individuals. This phenomenon, the competition and negotiation between a plurality of interest groups within the body of the people, is precisely the concern of the dominant theoretical current among liberal democrats in the post-war period, the pluralists. The most famous of these, Robert Dahl, even came close to the elitist position in his theory of polyarchy. Polyarchy holds that democracy does not, in fact, exist, but instead that the closest approximation is the distribution of power between a plurality of interest groups. Pluralists are similar to, and sometimes conflated with, a current of elite theory known as democratic elitism, whose most prominent exponent is Joseph Schumpeter. I take the view that democratic elitists, unlike pluralists, belong to the tradition of elite theory. The two currents do admittedly become indistinct in their analysis, but pluralists come out of the liberal democratic tradition, which is quite separate from that of democratic elitist, so that what can be observed here is an instance of convergence. This is not to say that there are no distinctions to be made. Thinkers like Dahl, for example, continue to maintain a certain enthusiasm for democracy, arguing for an ever greater approximation to its realization. This is not universal to pluralists, as some actually celebrate minimal political involvement from the citizenry. Pluralism has experienced something of a revival in recent decades in the form of neo-pluralism or agonistic democracy, whose most prominent exponent is Chantal Mouffe. Neo-pluralism reinvigorates pluralism's focus on the schizophrenia of liberal democracy, while avoiding the sometimes corporatist emphasis on harmonizing different interest groups, which is to be found in classical pluralism. Instead, neo-pluralism, taking influence from Carl Schmitt, with whom we shall engage at length in the sequel, focuses on intergroup conflict as the stuff of politics. Again, the historical subject of liberalism is not a collective entity. This can only generate an internal tension within liberal democracy, namely between the individual historical subject of liberalism and the collective entity that is the people. I would posit that this is due to liberalism being the most archaic of the three modern ideologies, and the closest of these to the perspective of traditional societies which did not recognize the existence of the people. This is not to say that liberalism is not modern. It is, but only that it is the least deviant from tradition of the three theories. As such, this strain is compounded by a further tension within liberal democracy, that between liberalism and nationalism. There is nothing in liberal ideology per se that implies a commitment to nationalism. Indeed, there is much reason to see a certain incongruity congruity between the two. Liberalism is both individualist and cosmopolitan in its principles, putting it at odds with nationalism from two different perspectives. Nonetheless, in the unfolding of modernity, Providence has seen fit to enmesh the two. Liberalism and nationalism were associated in the 1700s and 1800s. In practice, all liberal democracies are nationalist in their conception of what the people is. This is reaffirmed every time a politician claims to be speaking or acting in accordance with the will of the American people, calling on a supposedly undemocratic leader to listen to the voice of the British people, or an election is proclaimed to have expressed the will of the French people. It is my contention that this tension between liberalism's chosen historical subject and its de facto nationalism generates a dialectical dynamic that is inherited by communism and which is finally resolved only in fascism. Having demonstrated how, in practice, liberalism constructs the people, it becomes apparent that all of democratic theory is, in fact, liberal democratic theory. The debates between different positions within the field are all posterior to the fundamental question of what constitutes the people. This is not to say all democratic theorists are liberals in the sense of being fully committed to the liberal ideology in all of its axiological, historiosophical, and epistemological dimensions, only that their conception of democracy implicitly concedes the liberal construction of the demos. Indeed, many participatory and deliberative Democrats may be Marxists, but unlike orthodox Marxist-Leninists, as will be demonstrated in the sequel, they are liberals insofar as their conception of democracy goes. Participatory and deliberative Democrats may rail against aggregation and put forward all forms of measures to combat the alleged evils of aggregation. However, at the end of the day, when a decision must be made and consensus is impossible, participatory and deliberative Democrats still propose no alternative to voting, that is to say, to the aggregative liberal conception of the people's kratia, rule or power. Whether democratic theorists propose substantive or procedural definitions of democracy, whether their ideas constitute an ex post facto apologia for liberal democratic practice, as with Rawlsians or pluralists, or strident critiques of the status quo, as with Habermas, the following pillars of liberal democracy remain unquestioned. A. The people are comprised of a plurality of individuals. B. The will of the people is an aggregation of individual wills. And C. This will is ultimately constituted through the conduct of free, fair, and regular elections. However, this does not exhaust the ways in which democracy has been conceived in modernity. Before moving on, I would like to direct the viewer to figure 4. Here we can see our taxonomy of democracy taking shape. At the top of the taxonomy is indicated the ideological approach, and below that the attendant historical subject. On the row are those forms of liberal democracy that have been chosen by Providence for marginalization, either by their being overshadowed in discourse, instrumentalism, having existed in only brief or isolated instances, Jacobin democracy, or only in theory, pure direct democracy. On the next 2 rows are summarized the understandings of the will of the people and the people's relationship to the democracy's leadership. On the final row, we see the real-world instantiation of liberal democracy. All nationalist representative type democracies that vary only in terms of their being parliamentary, presidential, or mixed in their constitutional arrangements and in their greater or lesser use of direct democracy. Much popular discourse would regard the notion of communist democracy to be highly counterintuitive. This is a product of Western liberal presentations of the Cold War as a struggle between communism and democracy, when in fact it was a struggle between Marxist communism and liberalism. To argue that communists can be genuinely democratic to a scholarly audience should, however, require little effort. Forms of communist democracy that are readily recognizable as democratic to liberal Democrats abound. These primarily take the form of different kinds of models of direct democracy that differ primarily in the amount of power they allow to central authorities. These range from anarcho-communist models through the idealized vision of the Paris Commune in Marx, council communism and Luxembourgism, to the democratic centralism of Trotskyism and pre-1921 Leninism. These models can also be considered as deliberative and participatory forms of democracy. They are, however, not the subject of this section. The literature on liberal democratic theory recognizes that these forms of government are legitimately democratic, although such accounts usually focus on Marxist forms of democracy and ignore anarcho-communist models. They are also often contrasted with the supposedly undemocratic orthodox Marxist-Leninism or Stalinism. In this section, I have set myself the task of arguing that orthodox Marxism-Leninism constitutes a legitimate form of democracy. Having acknowledged the above direct democratic forms of communist thought, I will not address them further in this section. This is for 3 reasons. Firstly, as previously stated, they are already widely recognized as legitimately democratic. Therefore, their defense as such would contribute nothing new to scholarship. Secondly, save for a handful of mostly short-lived anarcho-communist mass societies, North Korea after 1992 and Russia from 1917 until 1921, every single state committed to communist ideology has been aligned with some form of orthodox Marxist-Leninism. Thirdly, it is orthodox Marxist-Leninism which offers an understanding of the people based on a completely different historical subject from that of liberal democracy. The various other forms of democracy endorsed by communists, Marxist and non-Marxist, whether in their direct, delegatory, semi-direct, or democratic centralist forms, all presume the same political subject as liberals, the individual. They all consider democracy to comprise participation in free, fair, and regular voting by individuals as individuals, who then become a people through the very act of voting. In other words, a mechanism that gives voice to their individual wills in a collective manner. Except for non-Stalinist democratic centralists, these currents criticize liberal representative democracy in its own terms. That is to say, they all make some variation of the argument that the institution of representation in some way silences the voice of the presumed working-class majority of the population, i.e. the will of the people, in favor of that of a presumed capitalist class minority. There is therefore nothing intrinsically communist in these forms of democracy espoused by certain kinds of communists. While participatory and deliberative democracy is often advocated by individuals with affinities for communism, albeit they may prefer to refer to themselves as socialists or Marxists, there is no inherent reason why a liberal could not also be a participatory or deliberative democrat, unless their commitment to democracy was purely instrumental. Should this be the case, as I have already demonstrated, it is dubious whether they could truly be termed democrats. The claim that orthodox Marxism-Leninism is democratic is likely to be jarring in the extreme. There can be no doubt that Marxist-Leninist states present themselves as democracies. Invocations of democracy in the very names of states, e.g. the German Democratic Republic, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Lao People's Democratic Republic, Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, Democratic Kampuchea, in constitutions and in public pronouncements are so frequent and insistent as to be shrill. Despite this, democracy in so-called Stalinist states is widely depicted by its liberal and communist opponents as a sham or a ruse. So why bother with this charade at all if it is so transparent? Pretenses are only of value if they take in the object of one's deception, and the practice of politics in communist states is so far removed from that of liberal democracies that only a fool, or one seeking to be deceived, could be deceived or hope to be deceived thereby. Whatever one's criticisms of Marxist-Leninist states may be, they were certainly not incompetent in the realm of propaganda. It is sometimes supposed that democracy is so ubiquitous that only by appealing to it can any kind of legitimacy be conferred on a state. And yet, not all states or political thinkers advocate democracy. Surely an outright rejection of democracy by a non-democratic state would be a sounder strategy than an unconvincing pantomime. Doesn't faking democracy concede the illegitimacy of the regime doing the faking? I do not expect a skeptical viewer to be conclusively swayed by these arguments, but I only ask them to set aside their own conclusions and entertain a different perspective, if only that the viewer's judgment judgments and criticisms of myself and or of communist democracy may be all the sharper as a consequence. In what follows, I will be working from the following hermeneutical assumption, that regimes that proclaim themselves to be democratic sincerely understand themselves to be so. This is not to say that they are democratic in a manner that could ever be acceptable to a liberal democrat, and that claims to the contrary are the result of misunderstanding and or malicious deceit. I am not making the kind of argument advanced by Grover Furr or Samantha Lomb that Stalin's 1936 constitution was an attempt to construct a participatory democracy in the Soviet Union. Rather, I am arguing that orthodox Marxism-Leninism has a completely different understanding of the people to what we find in liberal democracy, and as such has adopted a divergent conception of democracy. It is unsurprising that such notions of democracy are unintelligible to liberals. However, one ought to see that, provided one accepts the principal tenets of Marxism-Leninism, theirs is a legitimate form of democratic rule. Some liberal thinkers, like Kuhnelt-Ledin and J.T. Talman, have recognized that orthodox Marxist-Leninism is democratic. Talman did so by placing Marxism as a whole within a tradition of democracy which he juxtaposed with that of liberal democracy. The latter, he argued, by virtue of its liberalism, abstained from absolute truth claims and so always felt itself bound to respect the rights of dissenting minorities, while the former is characterized by the belief in access to objective truth and so does not feel itself likewise fettered. Kuhnelt-Ledin, by contrast, placed liberal and Leninist democracy in a common tradition. Orthodox Marxism-Leninism takes class as its historical subject. Indeed, one would be more specific and say it takes the class as understood in Marxist terms, that is to say in strictly materialistic terms of property relations. Within modernity, or in Marxist terms the era of capitalism, Marxism recognizes chiefly the bourgeoisie, defined by their ownership of the means of production, and the proletariat, defined by their selling of their labor in industrial production. As such, Marxism-Leninism identifies the people with the class. To appreciate why this equation is made, we must rehearse some basic Marxism. Marxism is by its own admission a materialistic philosophy. What is more, it is a philosophy of economistic materialism. History is seen to be driven not only by matter, but matter conceived in economic terms, the pursuit of wealth. Human relations are therefore seen as primarily a function of economic relations, and, as a consequence, the most important human collectivity is that shaped by economics, that is to say, the class. Of there being a plurality of economic classes, there also exists a plurality of people. This leads to Marxism-Leninism's recognition of many types of democracy, which was defined by Lenin as the systematic use of violence by one class against another. In other words, democracy is one class or people holding power over another class or people. It is for this reason that Lenin postulates the eventual abolition of democracy when the world is ridded of class. From this perspective, the ultimate aim of Marxism for Lenin can be said to be anarchy. This understanding of democracy makes intelligible what, to liberal eyes, are bizarre formulations like Mao's people's democratic dictatorship. Proletarian democracy is the dictatorship of the proletariat for the bourgeois, while bourgeois democracy is, for the proletariat, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. This is not to say that Marxist-Leninists imagine a moral equivalence between different types of democracy, only that they recognize a range of possibilities that could be legitimately considered democratic. Within the context of Marxist dialectical materialism's progressive account of history, these different forms of democracy may be sorted hierarchically as progressive improvements on each other. The driving engine of this process is the struggle of the proletarian class. Therefore, although Marxist-Leninists sometimes legitimize their advocacy of working class interests on the basis of the proletariat, sometimes in allegiance with the peasantry, comprising the overwhelming majority of society, a phraseology recognizable to liberal democracy, the real reason for their championship championing of the proletariat is because this class is seen as the engine of historical progress. Thus, for Marx and Engels, to win the battle of democracy is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class. The progressive ordering of different kinds of democracy is what allows Marxist-Leninists to advocate an intermediate stage between bourgeois democracy and proletarian democracy, what was called people's democracy by Stalin and new democracy by Mao. This stage entails communist parties participating in coalitions with so-called progressive elements of the bourgeoisie and, in the case of Stalin's people's democracy, participating in bourgeois elections. These examples of the intermediate stage are seen as an improvement on bourgeois democracy, though they resemble it more than they do proletarian democracy. Unlike new or people's democracy, full proletarian democracy is totally unrecognizable to liberals because Marxist-Leninists do not understand the people as a unitary actor produced out of an aggregation of individual wills. Rather, it is seen as a unitary actor with an objective interest existing independently of the individual wills that comprise it. The class has an interest which not only exists objectively in itself, but is also objectively knowable by the correct application of Marxist theory, which is fully congruent with Marxism's self-perception as a science. The economism of Marxism is such that the ultimate will of the proletariat could not be other than its material interest. Quote, "The question is what the proletariat is, and what, consequent on that being, it will be compelled to do. Its aims and historical action are irrevocably and obviously demonstrated in its own life situation as well as in the whole organization of bourgeois society today." End quote. And that was from Marx and Engels. Engels' conception of false consciousness refers precisely to proletarians being unconscious of the objective interest of the proletariat. This concept highlights the radical difference between the Marxist conception of the historical subject, and thus the people's will, and that of the people. To say that a rational, self-interested individual has an interest contrary to his assertions by virtue of his membership in a group, even if every member of that group rejects this notion, is unintelligible from a liberal perspective. These notions are likely to remind the viewer of Rousseau's concept of the general will. Such an association is of great service to my ends in this essay, as Rousseau is indisputably within the recognized democratic canon. Problematic to this end, the references to Rousseau or his concept of the general will in the work of Marx and Engels are few and of little relevance to the question at hand. One exception to this is the following quote, "In the Parliament, the nation had made its own general will into law, this meaning that it had made the law of the ruling class into its own general will." End quote. Here, Marx clearly does make an association between the objective interests of a ruling class and Rousseau's general will. This isolated reference is little to go on if I were to try to build the case that Marx is influenced by Rousseau, and this I will not do. Instead, I will follow the argumentation of Talman in placing Rousseau and Marx in a common tradition of democratic thought without arguing for a direct line of influence. There is little evidence in Hegel that he was influenced by or even really understood Rousseau's ideas. In this case too, the similarities in their notions of collective will are so great that Hegel merits being placed in this tradition that Talman calls totalitarian democracy or political messianism. In any event, if we can accept Rousseau's notions as a legitimate form of democratic thought, then one should be able to do so for the very similar ideas of orthodox Marxist-Leninists. We have now identified three elements in Marxist-Leninist thought: the people understood as the class's interest as something objective and free-standing above the will of the individual members of the class, and the possibility that some, or even all, members of that class are blind to this objective interest. To this we will add two further elements that complete our image of Marxist-Leninist democracy: the vanguard party and the opposition to faction. The vanguard party is a fairly straightforward concept. concept. The Communist Party is to stand above the masses of the working class so as to guide it. It is to be at the forefront of the proletariat as opposed to following it, termed tailism and clearly incompatible with the ideas sketched above, but should neither be far in advance of the class demanding that it catch up, termed commandism. The party comprises those elements of the proletariat that are most conscious of the true will of the class, that is to say, those who correctly discern the interests of the proletariat as determined scientifically in accordance with Marxist-Leninist theory. I quote again from Marx and Engels. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. That section which pushes forward all others, on the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. The party directs the people to conform with its own will, or what all individual members would see their interests to be if they were not benighted by the effects of false consciousness. This process may entail force in re-educating those with false consciousness. As such, it has been observed that the vanguard party has a tutelary function. It may also employ force in opposing the counter-revolutionary efforts of the previous ruling class, as what is democratic for the proletariat is acknowledged to be experienced as dictatorial against the bourgeoisie. In all this, we see parallels to Rousseau's notion that some individuals may be forced to be free. It should be clear that, in so acting, the vanguard party never departs from what is democratic. Democracy is rule in accord with the will of the people. The people are the proletariat. The will of the proletariat is equatable with its objective class interest, as distinct from the interests of its individual members. The vanguard party is constituted by those who are most conscious of this interest. Thus, the rule of the party affects the will of the people. From this perspective, we can see that the governments of Stalin and Pol Pot were entirely sincere in regarding themselves as democratic, albeit this is rule of the people as conceived in their own ideological language, one wherein meaningful discourse with those speaking the language of liberalism becomes impossible save for the bilingual. One can also observe the dominance of orthodox Marxism-Leninism over competing forms of communism in light of the unfolding of modernity. Orthodox Marxism-Leninism represents the full development of the view of class as historical subject, whereas other currents that still have an essentially liberal understanding of democracy represent intermediate stages in the dialectical emergence of communism from liberalism. This unfolding reached its realization in 1921 with the introduction of the final element of Marxist-Leninist democracy. At the 1921 Party Congress, the party voted to prohibit internal factions. This prohibition quickly became integral to the party's understanding of democratic centralism, and communist parties in other states were required to institute a similar prescription. It is notable that communist states which broke with the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, China, Albania, Kampuchea, maintained this prohibition after their break. This development was of enormous theoretical significance, as it is this concept that distinguishes orthodox from unorthodox Marxism-Leninism. It was the sin of Trotskyists and Czechoslovaks to reject the ban on factionalism. The implication of abolishing factions was that the vanguard party, as the representative of this interest, must have a single position, given that the people's will was seen as objective and unitary. An objectively determinable scientific truth cannot admit a plurality of interpretations. Once one has understood how Marxist-Leninists perceive themselves, their sincere claim to being democratic becomes quite intelligible. Thus, the conduct of elections by them no longer seems farcical. Virtually all communist states have held elections, wherein it is usually the case that, either de jure or de facto, only a single candidate approved by the Communist Party is permitted to stand. To dismiss these elections as a front intended to artificially generate a democratic legitimacy is, to my mind, an unsatisfying explanation of this phenomenon. phenomenon. Communist states went to great lengths to ensure their elections had very high turnouts. Why go to such lengths to put on a show that can be so easily dismissed, as any liberal democrat would do an election with a single candidate? However, once we are able to view these exercises from the vantage point of Marxist-Leninism, it then becomes possible to appreciate their significance. Unlike elections held by liberal democrats, this is an expression of the party's tutelatory function. Rather than generating the volition of the people out of individual wills, the latter must instead be brought into conformity with the former, as scientifically determined by the people's vanguard. To put forward more than one candidate would endanger their entire political enterprise, because a particular individual's voting intentions, under the influence of mistaken views or false consciousness, may deviate from the interests of the people. This would be to invite factionalism, which risks subverting the people's voice. Yet, it is imperative that as many people vote as possible so that the collective consciousness can be raised. Thus, what looks like a nonsensical exercise from within a liberal frame is entirely logical within an orthodox Marxist-Leninist frame. Some variants of orthodox Marxist-Leninist democracy allow for somewhat more of a role for the individual in the democratic process. The two key examples are those of Titoism and Maoism. Under Titoism in Yugoslavia, a system of workers' self-management of industry was established. This was intended as an alternative scheme of central command of the economy as practiced in most other Marxist-Leninist states. Workers' self-management functioned in a manner largely comparable to liberal representative democracy, but at the level of the firm. Considered in itself, it is consistent with liberal notions of democracy in terms of its notion of the demos as an aggregation of individuals, and in terms of its mechanism of operation. As such, it has met with great enthusiasm from contemporary non-Leninist Marxists as a blueprint for industrial democracy, and similar schemes continue to be proposed by Marxists today. As it was actually implemented, however, workers' self-management existed within the context of a state ruled by an orthodox Marxist-Leninist vanguard party, whose conception of democratic legitimacy conforms to the model described above. Thus, in Titoism, we find a model of democracy that is essentially orthodox Marxist-Leninist, whilst being somewhat more recognizable to liberal democrats. Another such model, albeit one closer to the purely orthodox Marxist-Leninist model, and perhaps only less alien to a liberal democratic perspective on a strictly theoretical rather than practical level, is the Maoist concept of the mass line. The mass line entails the party going to the masses in order to gain from them an understanding of their needs, wants and aspirations. Having collated these, the party is then to systematize them in light of Marxist science, thus screening out the distortions of false consciousness. The resultant program is to be propagated back to the masses. This approach is distinguishable from the Soviet model, and arguably closer to the liberal model, as it involves some degree of aggregation, even if the mechanism of this aggregation is not voting. It remains, however, firmly orthodox in its Marxism-Leninism, in that it maintains the leading and tutelatory role of a vanguard party. The process of discerning the will of the people contains an aggregative element, but only an element. To a far greater degree than in Titoism, compromise with the liberal conception of the historical subject is denied, and the interest come will of the people as something apart from the individual wills is upheld. The viewer may now refer to Figure 5 for a graphic comparison of liberal and communist conceptions of democracy. Before closing this section, a final observation is in order. As with liberalism, the communist conception of the people as class exists in tension with nationalism. Only the Soviet Union was thoroughgoing in its subordination of nation to class as its basis of its construction of the people. All other Marxist-Leninist states incorporated nationalism into their claims to legitimacy. The Polish People's Republic claimed legitimacy on the basis of its representing the will of the Polish people. Some communist states were or are rather intensely nationalistic, for example Romania, Albania, Democratic Kampuchea and North Korea, while Yugoslavia was actively involved in nation building. This tension remains unresolved in Marxist thought, but the question of nationalism allows me to segue into the third form of democratic thought. To argue that fascism is a democratic ideology will doubtlessly be met with much resistance. Some scholars of fascism, like Emilio Gentile, Stanley Payne, and Zeev Sternhal, regard fascism as not only undemocratic but anti-democratic by definition. In the ensuing, I will follow the current consensus definition of fascism as a pangenetic form of ultranationalism. Although scholars often see fascism as inherently anti-democratic, it is indisputable that fascists proclaim themselves to be not only democratic, but the most genuinely democratic. Quote, "If there has ever in history been a regime of democracy that is a people state, it is ours." End quote. Mussolini. Quote, "National Socialism is the true realization of democracy." End quote. Hitler. Quote, "The fascist state, on the other hand, is a popular state and, in that sense, a democratic state par excellence." End quote. Gentile. For fascists, as with all modern democratic ideologies, the people are the source of all legitimacy. Hitler expressed this in terms strikingly similar to American liberals. For example, he stated that legitimate government, quote, "never thought otherwise than in the people, with the people, and for the people," end quote. And, with echoes of Madison and Hamilton in The Federalist No. 49, Hitler declared that, quote, "it is the fundamental thesis of democracy that all power derives from the people," end quote. It is true that fascist literature is redolent with scorn for democracy, but a close reading of fascist texts reveals that the democracy upon which fascists pour opprobrium is always qualified. It is liberal, so-called, Jewish, bogus, bourgeois, parliamentary, or social democracy to which fascists are opposed, not democracy as such. This is regularly contrasted with true, Germanic, authoritative, authoritarian, or organic democracy. Liberal democracy is opposed not on the basis that the will of the people is illegitimate, but because it is a fraud in that it is surreptitiously reflects the will of sundry hidden agendas, e.g. capitalist interests, self-interested unions, or racial minorities, particularly Jews, while passing itself off as embodying the will of the people. Liberalism is distinguished from democracy and ultimately interpreted as opposed concepts. This is done by identifying liberalism with the principle of parliamentarism, which is distinguished from genuine democracy. This idea is most commonly identified with Carl Schmitt's The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy and is defended most clearly and systematically in that work. However, it may also be found in Müller-Vandenbruck's The Third Reich, published the same year as Schmitt's work and is referred to in Hitler's Mein Kampf. In this way, the fascist criticism of liberal democracy mirrors that of the communists. Democracy is not criticized per se, but liberal democracy is attacked for the falseness of its democracy. Before proceeding, it is important to acknowledge that, as with communism, fascism has also produced a plethora of ideological currents that espouse forms of democracy readily recognizable to a liberal democratic perspective. As with their communist equivalents, these will not be dealt with at much length, as they do not propose any new construction of the people. In addition, none of these more liberal ideologies, in terms of their conceptualization of the people, of course, have as yet ever come to power. However, these forms of fascist thought do deserve some more consideration than their communist equivalents, if only because they are less known to general scholarship and because they demonstrate the centrality of democracy to fascist self-perception. Most forms of fascism have espoused a type of corporatism conceived not only as a mechanism for dispute resolution and economic planning, but also, in some measure, for popular representation in the form of functional constituencies. What could be referred to as radical corporatists were those fascists who wished to make the replacement of regional with functional representation central to the fascist organization of the state. This constituted a faction of the Italian National Fascist Party, which proposed the party abolish itself in favor of corporatist democracy. Goebbels, in his pamphlet The Nazi Sozi, seems to argue for something very similar. Alexander Raven Thompson, chief ideologue of the British Union of Fascists, envisaged the coming corporate state as one of, quote, industrial self-government." End quote. A related current existed within the so-called left wing of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, as represented by Otto Strasser and Gottfried Feder. In his main work, Germany Tomorrow, Strasser, in a manner very similar to the above-mentioned Italians, proposed a democracy of vocational estates. Such a democracy of councils and estates would be complemented by a popularly elected monarch. Feder's vision, in his early essay The Social State, is even more liberal in its conception of democracy. In that paper, he proposes a bicameral parliament. The House of the People would be directed through regional constituencies as, quote, image of the political life of the entire people, end quote, whereas the Central Council would operate on the basis of functional representation, being, quote, the expression of the entire people's labor, end quote. Although Feder does not say so in The Social State, one may infer from his authorship of the National Socialist Party program that he envisaged voting being restricted to those of German blood. See points 4 and 5 of said program. In the post-war period, fascist currents like third positionism, as represented by Derek Holland, and identitarianism, as represented by Hélène de Benoit and Guillaume Fay, have enthusiastically supported participatory, direct democracy based on the Swiss model. These forms of fascist democracy, while distinct, are essentially liberal in their construction of the people, and thus of no further interest here. Instead, the remainder of this section will be concerned with fascism as it actually emerged historically. Fascism is nothing if not nationalist. As Dugin observes, mutatis mutandis, the historical subject of fascism is the nation. In taking the nation as its historical subject, it resolves a tension that exists in both liberalism and communism. Liberal and Marxist-Leninist states construct the people in terms of the individual and the class respectively, and yet insist on constructing the people in nationalistic terms. The legitimacy of liberal democracy is founded on its expressing the will of the British people. Non-British individuals are denied the vote and hence a role in the aggregative process of constructing the people. Granted, almost all liberal democracies allow for some mechanism by which individuals may become part of the nation, but the tension remains nevertheless. If the people is an aggregation of individuals, it is not at all clear, from the standpoint of liberal ideology, why these individuals must be part of a collective entity prior to their participation in the aggregative process, even if this collective entity is an open category. These tensions persist and are perhaps heightened in communism. If the socialist state is guided by the objectively determined will of the proletariat, why must this proletariat be of a national character? Do Khmer proletarians share a common interest, that is to say will, with Khmer bourgeoisie, which they do not share with, for example, Romanian proletarians? These tensions are resolved in fascism by submerging the categories of the individual and the class within the overarching category of the nation. Fascists do not see the people as an aggregation of individuals, but as an integral organism. Individuals are equivalent to cells and classes to tissues or organs. The racial conception of the individual's membership in the people, as espoused by most fascist movements, reinforces the biological character behind the fascist account of the people as opposed to the Marxian economic determinist construction. The organic conception of the people finds its origin in the integral nationalism of Charles Maurras and its apogee in the racial nationalism of National Socialism. Quote, "Race and people belong together. National Socialism has restored the concept of the people from its modern shallowness and sees in the people something different from and appreciably greater than a chance social community of men, a grouping of men who have the same external interests. By people we understand an entire living body which is racially uniform and which is held together by common history, common fate, a common mission, and common tasks." End quote. Friedrich Alfred Beck. Quote, "The idea of totality must be radically distinguished from the liberalistic conception of the mass. According to the liberalistic interpretation, the whole consists of a summation of its parts. According to the National Socialist organic conception of the whole comes before the part. parts. It does not arise from the parts, but it is already contained in the parts themselves. All parts are microcosmic forms of the whole. This organic conception of the whole is the deepest natural justification of the basic political character of all organic life." End quote. Friedrich Alfred Beck. Quote, "The central field of force of the National Socialist consciousness is rather the folk, and this folk is in no case mere individual aggregation, i.e. collectivity as sum of the individuals, but as a unity with a peculiar two-sidedness, at the same time essential totality. The folk is both a living creature and a spiritual configuration in which the individuals are included through common racial conditioning in blood and spirit. It is that force which works on the individual directly from within and from the side like a common degree of temperature, and which collects into the folk whatever according to blood and spirit belongs to it. The folk, point of departure and goal at the same time, is the National Socialist worldview, not only the field of force for political order, but as well the central factor of the entire world picture. Neither individuals, as the epoch of enlightenment envisaged, nor states, as in the system of the dynastic and national state absolutism, nor classes, as conceived by Marxism, are the ultimate realities of the political order, but the peoples who stand over and against one another with unqualifiable right to a separate existence as natural entities, each with its own essential nature and form." End quote. Herbert Skurla. And the word translated here as folk is, in the original German, Volk, more accurately translated as people. It may be observed that all three constructions of the people conceive of the people's will in terms of the people's self-interest. According to liberal theory, the individual is a self-interested utility maximizer. Therefore, a will constructed out of the aggregation of self-interested individual wills must, perforce, be a self-interested will. Similarly, Marxists conceive of the will of the people to be the people's objectively determinable material interests. Just so, in its organicist conception of the people or the nation, the fascist perspective equates the will of the people with the natural self-interested drive of an organism. If one adds to this Darwinian survival of the fittest, along with Nietzsche's will to power, the notion of a people having an inherent will over and above the will of any of its component parts to dominate and devour other nations readily presents itself. If the people is an organism with an inherent will, the deviation by itself, i.e. individuals or social groups, tissues and organs, from this will is pathological and undemocratic. Fascist totalitarianism, with its various manifestations such as corporatist management of the economy or socio-cultural Gleichschaltung, are, considered from this perspective, justified in that they bring deviant wills into line with the interests or will of the people. Furthermore, this logic greatly resembles Rousseau's notion of forcing people to be free, in compelling their conformity to the general will. In fact, Goebbels comes remarkably close to Rousseau's famous remark when he says, quote, "We want to free Germany, nothing more. If the German people is unwilling to become free, we do not care." End quote. Indeed, Carl Schmitt explicitly links his notion of democracy to those of Rousseau. One is therefore compelled to disagree with Talman when he states that fascism does not belong to his category of Rousseauian totalitarian democracy. Having assessed the fascist conception of the people and its will, how is this will exercised? How does the demos exercise its kratia? It does so through the figure of the leader. The leader is that individual uniquely capable of knowing the people's will. In keeping with the fascist organicism, the leader can be said to be the brain of the people. Quote, "The Führerreich of the German people is founded on the recognition that the true will of the people cannot be disclosed through parliamentary votes and plebiscites, but that the will of the people in its pure and uncorrupted form can only be expressed through the Führer. Thus, a distinction must be drawn between the supposed will of the people in a parliamentary democracy, which merely reflects the conflict of the various social interests, and the true will of the people in the Führer state, in which the collective will of the real political unit is manifested. The Führer is the bearer of the people's will. He is independent of all groups, associations, and interests, but he is bound by laws which are inherent in the nature of his people. In this twofold condition, independence of all factional interests, but unconditional dependence on the people, is reflected the true nature of the Führer principle." Thus, the Führer has nothing in common with the functionary, the agent, or the exponent who exercises a mandate delegated to him and who is bound to the will of those who appoint him. The Führer is no representative of a particular group whose wishes he must carry out. He is no organ of the state in the sense of a mere executive agent. He is rather himself the bearer of the collective will of the people. In his will, the will of the people is realized. He transforms the mere feelings of the people into a conscious will. Thus, it is possible for him, in the name of the true will of the people which he serves, to go against the subjective opinions and convictions of single individuals within the people if they are not in accord with the objective destiny of the people. He shapes the collective will of the people within himself, and he embodies the political unity and entirety of the people in opposition to individual interests. But the Führer, even as the bearer of the people's will, is not arbitrary and free of all responsibility. His will is not the subjective individual will of a single man, but the collective national will is embodied within him in all its objective historical greatness. Such a collective will is not a fiction, as is the collective will of the democracies, but it is a political reality which finds its expression in the Führer. The people's collective will has its foundation in the political idea which is given to a people. It is present in the people, but the Führer raises it to consciousness and discloses it. In the Führer are manifested also the natural laws inherent in the people. It is he who makes them into a code governing all national activity. In disclosing these natural laws, he sets up the great ends which are to be attained and draws up the plans for the utilization of all national powers in the achievement of the common goals. Through his planning and directing, he gives the national life its true purpose and value. This directing and planning activity is especially manifested in the law-giving power which lies in the Führer's hand. The great change in significance which the law has undergone is characterized therein that it no longer sets up the limits of social life, as in liberalistic times, but that it drafts the plans and the aims of the nation's actions. The Führer principle rests upon unlimited authority, but not upon mere outward force. It has often been said, but it must constantly be repeated, that the Führer principle has nothing in common with arbitrary bureaucracy and represents no system of brutal force, but that it can only be maintained by mutual loyalty, which must find its expression in a free relation. The Führer order depends upon the responsibility of the following, just as it counts on the responsibility and loyalty of the Führer to his mission and to his following. There is no greater responsibility than that upon which the Führer principle is grounded. Huber, quote, "The people, however, is never politically active as a whole, but only through those who embody its will. The true will of a people can never be determined by a majority vote. It can only display itself in men and in movements, and history will decide whether these men or movements could rightly claim to be the representatives of the people's will." End quote. Gottfried Nesse. Indeed, taken to its logical conclusion, the leader's will and the will of the people become one. Here we see the perfect inversion of the structure of traditional polities, where the divine monarch was seen to ontologically participate in the being of that which stands above the social pyramid. The leader of fascist states exists in communion with the masses that form the base of the pyramid, or better still, with the pyramid as a whole. This was expressed by Goebbels most succinctly as "Hitler is Germany and Germany is Hitler." Cornelio Cadrianu and Gottfried Nesse give a more theoretical exposition of the same idea. Quote, "Dictatorship presupposes the will of a single man forcibly imposed upon the will of the other subject in a state. In other words, two opposing wills, that of the dictator or a group of men on the one hand, and that of the people on the other. When this will imposes itself by constraint and cruelty, then the dictatorship is tyranny. But when a nation with a majority of 98% in indescribable enthusiasm, a nation of 60 million or one of 40 million souls, approves and deliriously applauds the chief's measures, it means there is a perfect accord between the chief's will and that of the people. Moreover, they mesh so perfectly that there no longer exist two wills. There is only one, the will of the nation, the expression of which is the chief. Between the will of the nation and the leader's will exists then only one relationship, a perfect rapport between them." End quote. Codrianu, quote, "The people cannot as a rule announce its will by means of majority votes, but only through its embodiment in one man or in a few men. The principle of the identity of the ruler and those who are ruled, of the government and those who are governed, has been very forcibly represented as the principle principle of democracy. But this identity becomes mechanistic and superficial if one seeks to establish it in the theory that the people are at once the governors and the governed. A true organic identity is only possible when the great mass of the people recognizes its embodiment in one man and feels itself to be one nature with him. Most of the people will never exercise their governing powers but only wish to be governed justly and well. National Socialist Führung, leadership, sees no value in trying to please a majority of the people, but its every action is dictated by service to the welfare of the people, even though a majority would not approve it. The mission of the Führung is received from the people, but the fulfillment of this mission and the exercise of power are free and must be free. For however surely and forcefully a healthy people may be able to make decisions in the larger issues of its destiny, its decisions in smaller matters are confused and uncertain. For this reason, Führung must be free in the performance of its task. The Führer does not stand for himself alone and can be understood not of himself, but only from the idea of a work to be accomplished. Both the Führer and his following are subject to the idea which they serve. Both are the same substance, the same spirit, and the same blood. The despot knows only subjects whom he uses, or at best for whom he cares. End quote. Nice. Codreanu's talk here of applauding allows us to segue into the question of how the leader is chosen, itself a question of how the people expresses its will. In fascist theory, the people choose a leader through acclamation, to use Schmidt's term, applauding with quote, indescribable enthusiasm, end quote. It may be noted here that this means of choosing a leader as a representative, if not an embodiment of the people's will, is more recognizably democratic, from a liberal perspective, than what we find in orthodox Marxism-Leninism. A representative is chosen, and the people is the body that does the choosing. Quote, the will of the people can be expressed just as well and perhaps better through acclamation, through something taken for granted, an obvious and unchallenged presence, than through the statistical apparatus that has been constructed with such meticulousness in the last 50 years, compared to a democracy that is direct, not only in the technical sense but also in a vital sense. Parliament appears an artificial machinery produced by liberal reasoning, while dictatorial and Caesaristic methods not only can produce the acclamation of the people, but can also be a direct expression of democratic substance and power, end quote, Schmidt. Not to suppose, of course, that a liberal democrat would find the fascist theory of democracy by acclamation compelling, only more recognizably democratic than the determination of the people's will by a self-selected vanguard of idiocratic specialists. This notwithstanding, the fascist system of acclamation is distinct from the vision of, and unacceptable to, liberals precisely because of the difference in the basis of their respective constructions of the people, i.e. their differing historical subjects. Rather than construct a central will by aggregating those of individuals, acclamation allows the people to speak as an organic entity with a single voice. As Schwarzberg observes in her study of ancient Greek democracy, quote, whereas aggregation presupposes both that individual judgments are separable and of intrinsic value, acclamation holds that the body as such is the relevant agent of decision, end quote. The people, as such, invest their trust in a singular leader, thus fusing their will with his in an inversion of the mystic's experience of unity with the absolute, and thereby, by virtue of the absolute's infinity, with all that is. Müller-Vanderbroek states, quote, leadership is not a matter of ballot boxes, but of choice based on confidence, end quote. The people choose not so much through voting, but through a collective display of confidence. The classic example of this is the ascent of Mussolini to leadership, following the popular reception he received on his 1922 march into Rome. Perhaps ironically, the more radical Hitler came to power by election rather than acclamation, though in any case the National Socialists viewed this and his subsequent popularity as equivalent to acclamation. Quote, with 38 million votes, the German folk has elected a single deputy as its representative. Ball. End quote. The selection of the leader by acclamation may be seen as a fulfillment of Max Weber's prophecy that liberal democracy would degenerate into a Caesaristic democracy. Indeed, Italian fascists cited Weber's theory of charismatic authority directly in the legitimization of Mussolini's leadership. Liberal democratic elections also entail a degree of charismatic authority. Indeed, elections could be seen as a routinized process for selecting the most charismatic leader, albeit encumbered by the trappings of legal rational authority. Acclamation could be seen as a form of democracy freed of such trappings. Fascists could also claim to be closer in spirit to ancient Greek democracy than liberal democrats. It is true, ancient Athens introduced voting very early on. It is most likely that in its earliest phases, the Athenian democracy made use of acclamation. What is more, even after the introduction of voting, most votes in Athens were taken by an impressionistic estimate of a hand count, which Schwarzberg argues is, quote, closer to acclamation than aggregation because, quote, although estimation does of course entail a sort of impressionist count, the procedure does not precisely account for each person's individual judgments. It too simply captures the dominant sentiment of the crowd, and in this way may more closely resemble acclamation than aggregation, end quote. Thus, fascist theoreticians like Carl Schmitt and Guillaume Fay are quite justified in seeing the leader system as truer to ancient Greek democracy than is liberal democracy. This may be confirmed by the greater similarity that Constant's Liberty of the Ancients bears to fascism's construction of the will of the people than it does to the liberty of the moderns, read liberals. Furthermore, important German fascist thinkers like Alfred Rosenberg and Müller-Vandenbroek saw the acclamation of the leader by the people as rooted in ancient German traditions of elective kingship. Quote, democracy was the people. There was no social contract, but there was the bond of blood. The democracy of those days was the self-government of the people in a manner suited to the conditions of their life. The distribution of rights and duties implied by these conditions, which was a feature of the law of the confederations, was based on the practice of self-government. This law recognized the right of the tribes to assert their power inside and outside the tribe, as might seem necessary to them for their own self-preservation. This was the origin of leadership, the free choice of free men who chose them a duke to conduct their forces to victory. German races distributed themselves over a larger and larger area. The next step was to elect themselves a king to secure a consistent and continuous policy, and to this end it was natural that the office of king should be vested in one particular and well-trained stock. All this was democracy pure. The people in their confederations established the law, and the leader, whoever he might be, put the law into effect as executor of the people's will. The German state was the commonwealth of the people, and its unwritten constitution, if we may be allowed the word in so early a context, was the sum of the people's habits, morals, and customs, traditionally expressed in the popular assemblies in which every member of the nation appeared in person and took his share in the decisions that determined his fate. End quote. Fascist states are universally acknowledged to be dictatorships. Codreanu and Nice's efforts to distinguish between the dictatorship and leadership, referred to above notwithstanding, it may be said that for fascism, democracy and dictatorship are not mutually exclusive, as explicitly argued by Carl Schmitt. As Schmitt acknowledges, this is a point of similarity between fascism and communism, although Schmitt does not note the differences. For the Marxist-Leninist, all democracy is the dictatorship of one class. For the fascist, true democracy is the dictatorship of one man who embodies the will of the nation. This dictatorship is a purer form of democracy as, since the leader participates ontologically in the people, no liberal restrictions or checks on power are necessary. These would only be required to prevent deviations from the people's will or to preserve individual liberties from the people's will. Fascism views the latter as an antisocial pathology and the former as unnecessary, since democratic dictatorship constitutes a kind of direct democracy, given the identity of the leader with the people. This being so, no restriction may be placed on the leader, as this would be undemocratic. Quote, "The authority of the Führer is not limited by checks and controls, by special autonomous bodies or individual rights, but it is free and independent, all-inclusive and unlimited. It is not, however, self-seeking or arbitrary, and its ties are within itself. It is derived from the people, that is, it is entrusted to the Führer by the people. It exists for the people and has its justification in the people. It is free of all outward ties because it is in its innermost nature firmly bound up with the fate, the welfare, the mission, and the honor of the people." End quote. Huber. Fascists praise for, quote, "authoritarian democracy cease to be bizarre oxymorons and become entirely intelligible. The more authoritarian the dictator is, the more democratic he is, because he is the people, and so concentration of power in his hands is tantamount to giving power to the people. The inversion of the traditional political order is complete. Rather than, as an Ottoman saying goes, the king being God's shadow on earth, the leader is the people's image reflected in the sky, so to speak. Not only is the source of legitimate power inverted, but there is also an inversion in the power holder's relationship to the source of power, where the emperor ultimately pales into nothingness before the absolute, the equality of all men before God. The leader exercises authority over the source of his authority. In this essay, a new taxonomy of democracy has been proposed. In summary, the fundamental point of departure for this taxonomy is how a particular form of democracy constructs its defining actor, namely the people. This notion, being essentially a fictitious social construct, is theoretically malleable and thus open to a plurality of conceptions. Accordingly, the meaning of rule of the people depends largely on how this notion is understood. When we then proposed that the three political ideologies of modernity, liberalism, communism, and fascism, construct the people, and consequently the nature of their rule, in terms of their respective historical subjects, i.e. the individual, the class, and the nation. This consequently produces wildly differing forms of political practice. Liberal democracy takes the will of the people to be an aggregation of individual wills, something which are given effect by the exercise of a free vote. In societies where liberalism is metapolitically dominant, democracy is often identified with this specific mechanism. Communist democracy entails scientific or ideological, depending on one's stance on the soundness of Marxism, experts determining the objective interests of the people, conceived of in terms of a dialectical materialist class analysis and identified with the people's objective will. Fascist democracy conceives of the people in terms of an integralist or corporatist nationalism. That is to say, it sees the people/nation as an organic entity and identifies the leader as the brain of the people. In so doing, the leader's will and that of the people are indistinguishable. While all of these forms of democracy ultimately justify political practices that are coercive towards individuals, the coercion that communist and fascist democracies produce are obviously vastly more dramatic than that of liberal democracy. Additionally, an outline has been provided in this essay of how political legitimacy operated in traditional societies. In said societies, ultimate authority belonged to the absolute and was conferred on human society in a hierarchical manner, beginning with the paramount leader, who often participated ontologically in the absolute, and then flowing downwards. By contrast, all modern political orders are democratic in that they derive legitimacy from below rather than from above. It has been argued that fascism is a perfect inversion of traditional political order in that the leader is conceived as participating ontologically in the people, and so fascism could thus be said to be the most modern of political ideologies. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi. Links in the description.